if I can invite up Mark Taylor from Director of Allies and Morrison Architects, Bianca Wong, Global Head of Sustainability, Sean Butler from Schueco, Commercial Director, Michael Stacey, Architect and lecturer, teacher, and Billy Field, Dane Architectural Systems. First question, what do you think the built environment of 2050 should look like? And that's both at a UK level and globally as well.
First off, we need to be cognizant of the fact that 80% of all the stock that will be in existence in 2050, which is our kind of target date here in the UK, is already built. So I guess point number one is we have to start looking at that 80%. We've got to do something with this stock, and we need to understand how to treat existing buildings with care, with sensitivity, with effectiveness, and with efficiency. I think the first thing is that we've got a deep refurb. We've got a deep refit and take these buildings carefully down, maybe back to their structure. There is so much carbon locked up in building structures that it's probably not a good thing to touch the structures. So I think when we do this analysis, I think that's the first question: can we preserve what we already have before we start building new cities and carving up greenfield sites to build new buildings?
We should remember that demolition is sometimes the best option. In most cases, reusing existing buildings saves between 4 and 46% of the carbon. But if you convert a warehouse into a multi-occupancy residential building, it uses 17% more carbon than a new build. So we should be doing the science seriously. We should understand life cycle analysis. That data should be available to the built environment for free and should be understood by the graduates of the built environment. And that's part of what we do at the Bartlett, or is seeking to do at the Bartlett.
So what role does legislation have in encouraging or even enforcing change?
As Dane Architectural, we're the people that design a facade and we put it on the building. We design it to a performance spec, so Mark will design it and I'll go and buy the glass. When I started looking into the research of this, it was like, wow, what is going on in the world? Half of us, and even people in the company I've spoken to, we are not aware of this drive that's happening. So for legislation, you need to educate and bring it right down to the bottom level, because if we design now to the amount of carbon that we're putting into that design, we're starting to move in the right direction. And really, I would say, make the whole thing a bit simpler. You know, a lot of the things that I've read have really, so I'm sitting there thinking, well, how does that work? What is carbon? You know, what is 8 square meters of something that's a word? Until we bring it down to an understandable crisis, this needs to change, like we did with recycling all your plastics and your bottles and everything else. People won't understand why you're doing it.
Sean, what would you say about the role of legislation enforcing change? What's your view on it from Schueco's point of view?
Well, I think you need legislation, this idea of carrot and stick. You definitely need a bit of stick to make sure that this happens. I think the idea that we all want to live with a sustainable future is something that we all hold dear to our hearts, but when the finances get involved with it, I'm afraid money talks. And without legislation, this stick, so to speak, I'm afraid these things won't happen. So I think it's absolutely required.
So one interesting thing that I'm starting to see, on one extreme you have developers that will build and sell and move on, and the other extreme you have owner-occupiers or institutional investors that hold their building stock for long periods of time and therefore have a different perspective on their assets. So Michael's there with the microphone, so I'll pass it over to him.
2 points. David Cameron cancelled Code for Sustainable Homes in March 2014. That was a bad setback for this country. So we've got to be very careful that we don't allow our politicians off the hook. We don't need more and more certified voluntary schemes that people have to pay for. We should return to decent building regulations, and that should include the rented sector. Our nation has allowed new slums to be created in our names. And that is just not tolerable.
Thank you very much. And to Mark, who was keen to have the next word on this.
Okay, Tom, I think we all have a role in legislation. Right now, there's a consultation out for something all the time, and we can get involved. Particularly now, one bee I have in my bonnet is the Bartlett consultation, which I think is a complete letdown, a downgrading of standards for the London boroughs. And we can have a part in that if we just join in on that consultation. So I would encourage everybody to get involved in whatever the way they can, whether it's writing to an MP, going and joining the school kids on a march to Westminster. You know, there's an awful lot we can actually do to get involved and feedback, because I think government does need that feedback, and the more people who shout, the more they'll listen.
I definitely second that. You know, the more consultation responses, you know, that democratic voice approach does work. So, a question for Bianca on embodied carbon. So, the World Green Building Council released Bringing Embodied Carbon Up Front, a report stating that carbon emissions released before the built asset is used will be responsible for half of the entire carbon footprint of new construction between now and 2050. I think Tom Paul had a hand in these questions, actually. What role does legislation have in confronting this?
I think we can all agree that legislation is needed, and we're definitely going to need to stick in this situation as well. It's very important to set the direction of travel to create and accelerate that market change, and then ultimately send a signal to business. Embodied carbon is quite complex. I think we all have a part to play in reducing embodied carbon, particularly manufacturers. So what are we doing about it? So last year in 2018, we committed to science-based targets. So we've set a 10% reduction target across our value chain in terms of emissions. We've been very successful in Kingspan in terms of reducing carbon emissions within our own boundary. But as we all know, when you go out of something that's beyond your control and you're trying to influence suppliers, it is quite difficult. But I think ultimately, if we want to get to net zero embodied emissions, it will require legislation. It'll also require mass collaboration across the value chain, very meaningful, quantified, measuring kind of metrics. What are you achieving year on year and trying to do better? And then also financing. You know, all of this needs to be financed. A lot of commonly used building materials by nature are carbon intensive industries. So we're going to need scalable solutions to actually bring that to fruition and help manufacturers decarbonise in the future, and that all needs to be financed.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to what I said before. You know, at the end of the day, the designer is putting, you know, an array of different products into the facade, which is my speciality. But here we got Kingspan looking to lower their emissions. So, you know, if I'm not put on or given a guidance as to where I need to be in terms of the carbon range in my design, I could go to Schueco, who I know are working hard on their carbon emissions. I could go to Kingspan, and then it'll be cheaper for me to go and buy something in China, and all that good work has gone because I'm not being driven to a certain target, right, in what I buy and what I put on that facade.
So then that would sort of push you towards the role of legislation in making sure there's an equal playing field, that you would get recognised for sourcing better quality materials. The question of embodied carbon often brings to me this idea of, and as the Climate Committee report on, the Committee on Climate Change report indicated that we should be building with more timber to fix carbon into the built environment. Those elements, plus the architectural flexibility and the resilience of aluminium and metal cladding type systems. So how do you see that narrative going?
As part of the Towards Sustainable Cities research that I undertook with Kieran Timberlake, we looked at the embodied impact of 4 types of windows. We looked at all aluminium thermally broken windows, aluminium clad wooden windows, all wooden windows, and PVC-U window frames. What was unusual about that life cycle analysis is we studied an 80-year in-use phase. We also looked at high, low, and no maintenance. The interesting thing is the all-aluminium window has the lowest total embodied impact, over 80 years before you recycle it if you don't want it anymore. The wood industry could respond with a much better paint system because the wooden window needs to be repainted every 8 years. If you don't repaint it, it rots and it releases its CO2. So when you read people write, and there are reputable books that say this, if you can't understand the mathematics of life cycle analysis, specify wood. I'm afraid that's not correct. Timber inside buildings is great because you are looking after the CO2 and you're keeping it for as long as the life of the building. But wood is not easily recycled. It is typically burnt. There are great examples of reuse of timber, like ships' timbers becoming famous buildings in this nation. Life cycle analysis is not difficult. There are books about it. If any of you run Revit, which is a building information model, you can run a software called Tally, developed by Kieran Timberlake, and that does life cycle analysis on the fly in real time. Now, we've done this for the life cycle analysis of construction processes. So in the 20th century, you made concrete with a timber shutter, and at the end, you burnt the timber shutter. And the timber shutter became 45% of the embodied energy of the concrete, and it was gone, lost, carbon again. If you use a reusable metal shuttering system, steel or aluminium, typical recycling time is 250 to 350 uses, with a bit of maintenance. The embodied energy of the concrete becomes 98%, the concrete mix and the rebar. And the big news for the homeowners, the building owners, the contractors, is that process is more economical. So there are actually win-wins out there. The global recycling of aluminium in 2014 saved 100 million tons of CO2es. This stuff is not too difficult. Greta Thunberg said that we can have transformative action. We can make the difference. We have the science, the skills, and the software to make a difference.
One of the industry concerns is one of the bigger challenges in the delivery of energy-efficient buildings is the performance gap between design intent and what's delivered in practice. Now, there's a difference between regulated energy and occupational energy. What I would say is if we do not eliminate or substantially reduce the performance gap, we'll never achieve net zero carbon buildings. So the question to you, Sean, is what do you see as the route to eliminating or minimizing the performance gap? And what role do designers and suppliers have in this? Actually, it's quite a few questions. Is off-site construction and standardization of products, of elemental performance of materials, is that the solution or something else?
Okay, so this is, in our particular sector of the industry, this is a massive challenge. So the way Schueco takes its products to market, which is not untypical of a system supplier in our market, is that we third-party test our products to whatever required standards. We therefore know that our systems, if they're properly designed, by that I mean applied to the building, the project design, fabricated and installed, that the system will perform to its designed and claimed standards. We know this. But of course we don't sell a finished product. We have a reliance on people like Billy at Dane to do the project design, fabricate and install. We know that off-site, you mentioned, Tom, off-site construction. We know that off-site construction, whilst it's not suitable for all buildings, it can actually reduce some of this risk because it's easier to control quality in factory conditions than on-site. So that's a potential positive step forward, you may say. Training is a massive issue for us. So we have 4 full-time trainers. We train over 2,000 people a year in our head office in Milton Keynes, in our training centre. We're absolutely paranoid about the quality of the install on site because it's our name that's at risk. And if it goes wrong, then it's seen as a poor Schueco facade, not as a poor Dane facade or whatever. It's our name that's on it. Yeah, it's complicated and it's very challenging.
I'll respond to Sean first, because I spend a lot of time beating manufacturers up and supply chain up for better information, particularly about things like heat flow. There are manufacturers, all sorts of products that thermally bridge the building envelope, and I want 2- and 3-dimensional heat flow analysis from them, and I'm not getting it. And I go and talk to a lot of manufacturers about these sort of things. To their credit, Schueco, I can go to Schueco and I can get an entire building envelope, complete 2- and 3-dimensional heat flow analysis. So I know exactly how much heat loss we're going to get through that building, and obviously with the glass, with the heat gain and things like that. And that upskilling needs to happen throughout the supply chain industry. Great support from these guys to these guys. And I think this cross-fertilization of knowledge and of technical support to bring robust products forward that are properly tested and that come with the full information we need, because there really is a dearth of information. There's so little understanding of heat flow in building envelopes throughout the entire strata of the industry, from building control right through to ourselves, the designers. And so I think we all need to upskill and learn from those sort of things.
Yeah, coming back to Sean and both your comment there. Not so long ago, we used to turn up at a building where there was a concrete frame, and there would be a guy come along with a stack of aluminium stud, build an SFS system, fill it with insulation, then we'd come and put a window in, and then we'd try and join EDPM so we've made it watertight. And we're expecting, as a company, and we guarantee for 12 years the workmanship of those guys in all weathers, in all conditions. But we do have a problem looming. It's, beyond the climate, we have a labour problem. Okay, we can't get 17-year-olds in the UK to turn up on site at 7:30 in the morning and become an installer for Dane Architectural. And we now have to rely on Romanian and Polish. And how long are they staying for? So what we're doing, we came to Schueco and we came to Kingspan, and we said, look, we as an industry need to pull this together, and we are trying to get to a point where we modularize the backing wall. We put the window in it in a factory, we bring it to site, and we then have a designed interface between the two, so we get that quality that we need. And in what we're talking about today, that means I'm not designing a component from here, and I don't know the performance of that, and a component from here, and I'm expecting it all to work together. Our cladding industry has been through an absolute massive shift after the event of 2016, and what it taught us is we can't bring things ad hoc and just put them together. We have to start to develop systems, and if we need to develop systems, we have the advantage now of actually saying, let's rate this, let's find out its carbon impact, because Sean can say to me, yeah, we're doing all this work, and I go to a different manufacturer because he's cheaper, and all of a sudden I've just added 25 tonnes of carbon because he doesn't care about how he does his electricity, etc. So really, as designers, you're the guys who are going to make the change, because I'll do whatever you want me to do. I argue a lot, but I've still got architects coming to me wanting 3 metre by 3 metre shop windows, and is that really carbon efficient? If the industry starts to systemise, so it's all coming from a source that's known, can be calculated, we might start getting somewhere.
My closer for the panel, which is the climate emergency demands urgent, impactful action now and not in 5, 10 or 15 years. And we've heard some of the answers, actually, very interestingly, in the panel responses. But what are you doing to support the delivery of rapid decarbonisation? And given that here in the UK there's been a general election announced, what is the number one commitment to change you would like to see from our politicians?
By 2050, I would hope that when I'm designing a 40-storey high residential tower or 15-storey high office, that the leasing system will have kicked in, and that we would be leasing the facade from Billy, and it's been supplied by Sean, of course, and that when it reaches the design life, which would be very, very accurately predicted because of the science that goes into it, that Billy will come along and take it back and put a new one on, and that Sean will take back from Billy what he's taken off the building, and that it will all be reprocessed, reused, and put back into the system. And at the moment, there is just no incentivization to do that. And that is a major, major global shift that's got to take place, I think, for the circular economy to operate properly.
We know, probably at our cost at Schueco, that serious government incentive can change things. So the solar panel market, which we were briefly in for about 5 years and then got out of very quickly when the government got rid of the feed-in tariff. I mean, that just shows you the power of these of government and legislation. So I think a serious incentive is needed, and to be honest with you, it won't work without it. So that's what I'd like to see from this.
One thing I think it was Mark mentioned, or it may have been Michael, which was the getting rid of VAT on refurbishment, was one very simple.
I would totally agree with Sean. We need stable government policies. We don't need chopping and changing. Because that's not good for homeowners, it's not good for suppliers, it's not good for manufacturers. We should consider carbon imports and support UK manufacturing. We should be able to source at least a good proportion of our buildings from the United Kingdom, which is not to be, too narrow. But I find myself advising a young couple who've just bought an end-of-terrace 19th century house in Newcastle. They haven't got great incomes. It's their first home. If they could take out a carbon mortgage because they are going to decarbonize their house, and maybe that pays back over the sort of 25 years like an economic mortgage, and those two work in tandem, perhaps we could transform the nation. I think some parties are suggesting subsidy. And you could say a green revolution would be a great thing. We went into the Industrial Revolution first in the 18th century. We started this carbon expenditure. So although we're a small island off Europe, next to the island of Ireland, we need to lead the world in showing that we can decarbonize the United Kingdom.
Thank you all very much for coming. If you could just join me and say thank you to all the panel today.